The dust is far from settled on Ukraine's worst 24 hours of violence since it broke off from the Soviet Union. After the shooting death of 2 protesters, the fatal beating of a third, scores of injuries Tuesday and Wednesday, a snap session of Parliament has been called for next Tuesday, perhaps with an eye to dissolving the government and repealing hastily crafted new anti-riot laws. But the Prime Minister has ruled out snap elections for now and calls the pro-EU movement a coup attempt. The latest spike in violence, featuring far-right nationalists pitted against police, emboldened by the government's bid to break a mostly peaceful opposition that has stayed in the streets since President Yanukovych suddenly pulled out of an EU trade pact in favor of Moscow back in November. Could the Russian-speaking president still lose his seat over the violence, or will Yanukovych ultimately drive a wedge between the mainstream opposition and hardcore Ukrainian-speaking nationalists whose violence scares off many? Also, how are Yanukovych's backers in Moscow going to play it? Vladimir Putin has made Ukraine a red line for Western influence, but could he back an eventual full-fledged crackdown just at the moment when he's getting set to host the upcoming Winter Olympics and wants to show the world his best face? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what could be make or break time for Ukraine. And with us from Kiev, correspondent Gulliver CRAGG, also joining us, Iryna SKLIAR of the European Center for a Modern Ukraine. Thank you for being with us here in the debate. We want to thank from Brussels, Polish member of the European Parliament, Jacek SARYUSZ-WOLSKI. Thank you for joining us. FEMEN activist SHEVCHENKO is with us in the studio, as is reporter Julian Nundy. Nice to see you, Julian. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. We're dealing with what's effectively a breaking news story at this hour. After the opposition decreed a short truce, Ukraine's president calling an emergency session of Parliament for next Tuesday, Viktor Yanukovych in the company of the Speaker of Parliament.
The situation urgently requires a resolution. First of all, we need to act within the law. And secondly, let's not forget that there is that political space, the Parliament. So I would like to ask you to call the deputies together to discuss this question. Because the negotiations I'm having with the opposition are one part of resolving the situation. And the other is that the discussion needs to be moved to the Parliament.
Цю дискусію треба переводити на парламентську площадку.
All right, negotiations with the opposition that earlier were ongoing. Let's go to Kiev and France 24's Gulliver CRAGG. Gulliver, those negotiations still happening?
I think the negotiations must still be happening. I was just checking the Twitter feeds of the 3 opposition leaders to see whether or not they'd come up with any results from that. They went into talks with President Yanukovych around about 5:30 Kiev time, so 4:30 Paris time, in the presidential administration building right here in the center of Kiev, not far at all from Independence Square. And we haven't heard yet what the results of the negotiations were, so I guess they must still be going on.
And the news of a possible cabinet reshuffle and repeal of those new anti-riot laws, how's it gone down where you are?
I think that people are very, very skeptical, really, about these kinds of announcements coming from Ukrainian officials or from the president, because we've heard sort of news before that there might be a compromise, and then in the end, there hasn't been a compromise. But one person I spoke to, a Ukrainian who had been working for the European representation here in Kiev, did voice a sort of quiet optimism, saying perhaps the authorities are realizing that compromise is going to become essential, because if these protests spread, as they seem to have been doing today, to other towns other than Kiev, there were assaults on the regional administration buildings in cities like Lviv, Vinnytsia, Rivne today by anti-government protesters, which I think the police are now trying to get rid of them. But all the same, I mean, it's one thing to try to contain a protest that has turned violent in one area of one city. It's quite another thing if things start springing up all over the country. And so perhaps that has made Yanukovych think that he's going to have to go for some kind of compromise, though, of course, what kind of compromise that would be, we really don't know.
Iryna, SKLIAR, realistically, what kind of compromise can we expect?
Choisir l'épargne qui vous convient.
The compromise as voiced by the president or prime minister, possible reshuffling of the government is a first step, and it was long-awaited step that everybody was waiting for quite some time. I think that the president, the government are a bit late with the decision. They had to make similar steps a bit earlier to prevent the tensions, to engage in dialogue with the people, because the biggest problem of the government, as I see it now, they kind of distantiated themselves in the dialogue from the people. They communicate sometimes through press releases, through journalists, but they not engage in people. They're kind of ignoring the Maidan, if you would like to say. So maybe the last developments and the fortunate death of people. And I would like also here again to remember that people and to recall, to remind everybody that any political ambition cannot be worth a human life. So saying this, I might say that maybe every side has got a bit horrified of the developments. And I think it can be a step further. It can be a step to find a political solution indeed.
Do you agree with that, Iryna SHEVCHENKO? Do you think that 24 hours ago the talks were fruitless, that this time we may get something?
Well, you know, I'm not sure that the president really realized that he will go to any sort. He will have to go to any sort of compromise, because for now, what we can see that already for a few days those riots are going on, and what's happening is that what we just follow on Twitter and on different sort of resources, that people are sending pictures, finding out that Berkut, that is special troop of police in Ukraine, are bringing unknown, unrecognizable stuff to the square, and no one knows what's going to happen. They believe that something is prepared because tanks are already around, surrounding the square, people are killed, people are disappearing, activists are disappearing and tortured, and not so many people still know about it, even in Europe. What we see that the reaction of the government through action of policemen is not really coming down. And I'm not sure that he is realizing that he will have to go to any sort of compromise.
But we've seen this Thursday that there's much less tension in the streets of Kiev. That's what everybody is saying. And you heard the statements that the president made, that he's dissolved the emergency session of parliament.
Much less tension is not. It's not the result of policy of the president or of any sort of declaration of the government or president, right? It's because what people are doing. They are not there to fight with policemen and not to crash everything. They're not crashing windows at the shops around or something. They're not there to crash. What they're doing, they're continuing their protest. Yes, it's more radical protest, but it's not a hooliganism or something. What they are doing, what they do, they wait for decision, for any sort of decision. And today, what's happening is that I was really happy when I saw that leaders of government opposition, with their speeches, when they were coming out to people to say, calm down, people were not following them anymore. Right now, opposition is following the crowd. Right now, leaders of opposition like Klitschko or someone else, they are following the crowd because they see that this crowd is right now. It's not extremists. It's not radical protesters. They're those people who are extremely angry and radically oppressed. And right now they are fighting. Right now they are really coming, and they are not. They know that they were treated as an idiot for 2 months. They were singing, dancing for 2 months, and what they got at the end, they got the law that just suppress any sort of human rights for them, for all of them. So I'm not sure that the president and the government, they still realize that they will have to go to any sort of compromise. But I'm sure that they will have to go sooner or later.
Jacek, SARYUSZ-WOLSKI, what are your thoughts? Is President Yanukovych ready to bend?
I'm afraid not. One should have hope until the last moment, but the talks which are now being held by Klitschko and others perhaps will reveal the truth. My fear would be that those talks are made just to gain time for Yanukovych and administration to prepare the further forceful solutions. And all the facts which were just mentioned, including tanks being brought to Kiev and mobilization of Berkut and mobilization of the reserves of the military troops of the Ministry of Interior, bode badly for the future. Unless there is a solution negotiated now by Klitschko, we should not really trust that those gestures and words from the President Yanukovych are of any significance for the future, because so many times already in the past he has betrayed Euromaidan.
All right, so a lot of mistrust on the part of most of our panelists here for the president as he discusses with the opposition. Now, going into that second round of talks in 24 hours, the former heavyweight boxing champ turned opposition leader Vitaly Klitschko was asked about his resolve.
It's a chance, and we want to try to use this chance.
But what about your people? Will they stop using violence?
Right now, I talk to the police people, I talk to demonstrators. Stop right now the break. No fighting. It's the time, negotiation time. Break.
And if the talks don't work, if there's no result today like there was yesterday, what happens then?
I try, I give my best to stop the escalation.
Julian, Nundy, Vitaly Klitschko there saying, for now, no violence, we've hit the pause button.
Yes, he asked for an 8-hour truce today while the talks were, to give the talks a chance. I think that's why the tension has decreased somewhat, because there is this form of truce in place. But that doesn't mean that the violence won't start again. Or the conditions are getting very, very hard. The temperatures are due to go, is expected to go down to -20 Celsius overnight, and it's going to be tougher and tougher to keep going in these conditions. Although so far the protesters have shown no sign of flagging.
Julian, when we got the news yesterday that there had been fatalities, which is something that was never seen right during the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004, no. What was your reaction then?
Well, my reaction was one of fear, because every time something happens, there's a new radicalization. Is this the beginning of the real crackdown? Is this the beginning of really nasty violence? I mean, some politicians are talking about civil war, and that's very dangerous talk. That's a very dangerous prospect. But it's conceivable that this violence could increase and become worse in some ways.
Do you agree, Iryna, SKLIAR?
I would say that at this stage we cannot speak about civil war, and I hope we will never speak about it. Nevertheless, if there is no, if it don't make any steps to decrease the tensions, it could potentially develop in a bigger conflict. The question is that each party to the conflict has to make a step back or step forward towards more stable truce, let's say. The situation is that the biggest protesters now is focused on one spot. It's near governmental buildings on Europejska Ploshchad, Maidan Ploshchad. So that gives the hope that nevertheless it's not the nationwide radical movement or protest movement. It nevertheless has the signs of people discontent with the governmental policies, but also with the opposition policies, with the situation as it stands in Ukraine. So this is a bit dangerous, I would say.
And another item that's dangerous, and I'll mention it after I read to you, one of our viewers is saying the ongoing political crisis seems like a never-ending story. Gulliver, CRAGG, the situation calmer in Kiev today. The Associated Press is reporting that enraged protesters have stormed government offices in 3 western cities of the country.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's Lviv, Rivne, and Vinnytsia. Oh no, there's one other city. I'm not sure if the protests are only contained to those 3 cities. I think in Cherkasy as well. The latest news I was hearing was that riot police were storming back, as it were, the administrative buildings in Cherkasy that the protesters had taken over, and that a shot had been fired into the air by a riot policeman during that storm. This is the beginning of possibly, if people have been talking about civil war for a few days now, and I've found it somehow absurd and very strange when you're in a situation where the area where there's violence is very, very small indeed. The numbers of people who are involved can be counted in the hundreds, and that's it. And most of the time, more like in the dozens. And there are long periods of calm, as there have been today. But at the same time, people are constantly talking about a civil war. And I don't think that it's not a realistic possibility, but it hasn't been happening yet at all. What we've seen today was the beginnings, possibly, of action taking place in other cities, though those actions have not so far been consisting of violence on the scale that we've seen in Kiev by any means. But it is a very, very strange situation. There's violence in one small area of the capital city, but the situation is so tense and seems so intractable. And we've got people who are middle-class, peaceful protesters who, until just a few days ago, were insisting that these anti-government protests must remain peaceful, and are now watching people who are, in large numbers of the people who are engaging in the violence and who are taking on the policemen, large numbers of them are football hooligans, large numbers of them are members of far-right organizations, and nevertheless, middle-class, liberal, peaceful protesters are cheering them on because they don't see any other way to make the government listen.
And when we see, and I guess I'll put this to Jacek SARYUSZ-WOLSKI, when we see that this is where we've seen today flashpoints are in the Ukrainian-speaking west of the country, do you fear as though we're heading towards the divide that people said wasn't the case this time, the divide between the Russian-speaking east and the Ukrainian-speaking west?
I don't think so. I hope not. Why? Because the movement of Euromaidans has covered, to the astonishment of many commentators who preach this old type stereotype that Ukraine is divided or dividable into two. This movement happened also in the eastern Ukraine. And in Kiev, in Euromaidan, you have the representation of Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk and other cities from the east. So I don't think that we are close to this danger, although one could not exclude. But it is true that in Western Ukraine, the degree of assertiveness and resistance is higher than in the eastern part of Ukraine. But it should not automatically lead to this conclusion that it is boding badly for the unity, territorial integrity of the country. There are different levels of sensitivity all over the country, but it is not yet that. Although some, I'm afraid, might be interested in going into that scenario. I remember such remarks, serious or half-serious, by President Putin, who made them many months ago, saying, so you West take the western part of Ukraine and we will take the eastern part. It's something which majority of Ukrainians are refusing.
And we're going to pick up on that point and on the Russian position when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate.